Hi everyone. Today I want to take you through a virtual field trip of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And one of the things that I really love about living in New York City is that we have access to some of the most amazing artwork in the world. And a couple of years ago, I actually was traveling and I was in London and I was at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And there was an exhibit of porcelain that went kind of by decade, but it spanned all geographic regions. So normally we go to a museum and we see the Asian galleries, the European galleries, they're very separate. And this was an exhibit where it showed what each country was doing in porcelain ware at the same time. And it really struck me like, wow, look at all of this. And it relates directly to international trade because all sorts of porcelain designs, porcelain technology, techniques, it was all being traded along, really starting along the Silk Roads. So I wanted to bring you on this virtual tour of the Met to show you the importance of international trade in everything, but in this particular instance, the importance of international trade to the development of art. And we're going to start a little broader and then we're mostly going to focus on porcelain just because it is so easy to see the influence that trade has had on the development of porcelain. When I start a tour at the Met, I always start in the Asian galleries, and on the wall there is a map that is very similar to this one, and this is of the Silk Road, or what is more technically accurate, the Silk Roads. There is more than one road. And these are documented beginning with the Han Dynasty, which is 206 BC, lasted for about 400 years. And what you see on this map with the Silk Roads, we have China over on the right-hand side, and it extends all the way through India, through Turkey, through what was then Persia, Arabia, all the way to Egypt. And we also see up on the top there, you're just starting to get a little bit into the Roman territories as well. And the Silk Roads are really important, not only to trade, of course, everything was traded on the Silk Roads, everything from spices for food to different types of fabric to horses, camels, other livestock. So it definitely was used for trade. But throughout these roads, you also interacted with people. And so you had a lot of trading of culture and even religion. We see that Christian missionaries use these Silk Roads as well. And another exhibit for another day, but there actually is an exhibit at a museum in Europe of pocket Bibles. So there are missionaries who used the Silk Roads had these little pocket Bibles with them so that as they met people, other traders along the way, they could share some of the stories of the Bible. Usually they're in picture form, but they would share pictures of Bible stories. So everyone was interacting. You were learning different languages, you were learning just different musical instruments. So just really think of the trade roads as being this great place where there was a lot of exchange of data information as well as beliefs and values. And one fun thing that we see in art is the influence of trade. So this is a polo player, and a few interesting things. First of all, it is a female polo player. You can kind of see it from the details in her face and then her hair. I guess that's kind of sort of a bun. But female polo player because women were the prime athletes, at least on the polo field. But perhaps the more interesting thing is that she is riding a horse that would have been imported from Mongolia. So China was not known for having horses. So the very fact that you have a Chinese polo player on a very healthy, robust looking horse, that horse, anyone looking at that from that time period would say, oh, obviously this is an imported horse from Mongolia. So not only did we also exchange sports, but it also impacted art and how art depicted the reality of the influence of the trade routes. This is another example. This is a statue of a worker. This is from 7th century China. And take a look at his face. if you go to the Greek and Roman galleries, that face completely aligns with the Greco-Roman features that you see in a lot of the sculptures and paintings there. So again, this was clearly another exchange along those Silk Roads of, seeing some Greek and Roman traders and kind of merging that concept into the Chinese art forms. On this display, this is from the Tang Dynasty, late 7th century, and if you take a look at the instruments, especially the instrument over here on the far right that looks kind of sort of like a type of lute, that actually is an instrument very similar to what would have been found in India, and a couple others. Some of them are a little too small to see, but we also see just the influence of traders. If you are a trader, you may have brought along an instrument to play when you were bored, and those instruments would have gotten traded as well, and it then becomes part of the new culture, and it's neat to see that it's also reflected in the art of this time. When I showed you the map, I indicated that the Silk Roads also went through Persia. And this is an example. Again, this is still Chinese art. This one is from the Ming Dynasty. But this looks very Persian, and it's a bodhisattva, so definitely from the Buddhist religion, also would have been part of that trading of religious values and practices. And again, if I asked you, where is this from? What country of origin does this have? You probably would not have guessed China. You probably would have guessed, hopefully, would have guessed another Asian country. So again, just an illustration of how trade has really influenced every aspect of art. We also see art in some fun formats over the years, and this actually is a passport. So interesting to note that the system of tracking the travel of citizens dates way before the US ever became a country. And this is an example from about 1269, and Mongolia was one of the first countries to really have a systemic passport system. China had their own system, so they actually have documents that go back prior to 1200s that demonstrate that they were tracking all the international traders. It was almost like a hotel check-in system. So there are scrolls that they would keep that would document who was coming in and out of their territory. So this was something that was very important to the different governments at the time. And again, it's just neat to see that we now consider it artwork. And this passport would have been very similar to what Marco Polo carried when he was returning from Venice. So it basically would have given him permission to do the travels that he did. Art also reflects the reality of trade, and I apologize, this isn't a great picture, but it's the best one that I could find. This was on exhibit the last trip we took to the Met, and I could not find the online picture of it. But what this picture shows is a prosperous city. And first and foremost, if you look on the right-hand side, the section, of course, that got cut off, that is the ocean. So we see that the prosperous city is on an ocean because it is a port, and you see the comings and goings of all sorts of ships. The other thing that you can kind of sort of almost see in the very top right-hand corner is one of those ships. So very European looking ships with the big sails. I always think that they look like pirate boats today, but the very European large boats that would have been sailing around in the 1500s, those are all on kind of this outer edge that you can't really see. So again, just highlights that the prosperous city relied on trade, and at that time, it was a lot of trade between China and Europe. So now we're going to dive into specifically how trade has impacted the growth and development of porcelain. And the next time you go to the Met, you can take this tour on your own. So we have now walked up the big staircase at the Met, and we are kind of in the inner atrium, right around where the balcony area is. So we're basically just walking around the cases that surround that balcony area. So if you're interested, you can go there yourself and check all this out. There's a lot more information than what I'm going to cover in today's lecture. The first thing to know is that China, as we conceive it as porcelain, we typically think that it's white, some shade of white, right? And originally it was made from more durable clay, so it tended to be black or brown. So some of the earliest examples that we have are much darker. And it also represents already the diversity of trade because we see it's just the different shapes. So if we look all the way over at the right, that vessel that's kind of standing up, that is a kind of a Greco-Roman shape where the shapes towards the left are more traditional Chinese shapes. And then in the back here, we see a lion plate, and that design would have been from Europe. So just some examples of some very early China, not even porcelain yet, still China, that definitely shows the impact of trade. China quickly became the key maker of porcelain and really started to make money off of this by exporting their porcelain everywhere. And Chinese exports were typically called Nanking cargo. And the interesting thing is they weren't actually manufactured in Nanking. It was just kind of a term that European traders put on it. And again, they started with some more durable brown and tan china that didn't break as easily. Remember that you were still shipping things by boat and you still had to account for damages. So you're trying to pack things well, but the more durable clay meant that you didn't have as high of a loss. So the Chinese soon realized that there was great demand in Europe for pure white china. And the Chinese were the very first to be able to develop pure white china because they were the first to discover the kaolin deposits. And kaolin is a type of clay, it's a white clay that allows you to make this pure white china. So they discovered that, hey, we're on to something. We can make white china, no one else can, so we are going to exploit this. And this is a great example because you see that they're basically copying Mediterranean art. Again, this is something that you would have seen in Greece or Rome, the general shape, the handles. If you go through the Greek and Roman galleries, you'll see lots of this, except you probably won't see dragon heads at the top of the handles, which definitely is the Chinese addition. So really beginning in the 9th century is when China realized that they could produce this white porcelain, and this bowl, it seems such a simple bowl, but in the 9th century, so this was about 800s, it actually was the most technically advanced ceramic in the world. And if you look at it, this is a horrible picture, but if you're at the Met and you take a look at it, it looks like a pearl. It has that same kind of luster and the light kind of bounces off. It almost looks a little translucent. So it really is beautiful, much prettier than this picture indicates. But just think that the entire industry of porcelain in export wear in China began in 800s with this one bowl. I first really got interested in porcelain when I was working in Amsterdam. And of course, in the Netherlands, you see a ton of blue and white china, and I love blue and white china. So I just automatically associate blue and white porcelain as being very European, if not being very, very Dutch, right? Extremely Dutch. And the reality is the Dutch and everyone else stole it from the Chinese, and we'll get into that in a little more detail. But the very first kind of tradition that we see of using the blue is in the 1400s. So the Chinese were using their white porcelain that they figured out how to make, and then they were importing cobalt from Iran. So this is a way, again, trade facilitated them getting the raw material, cobalt, that they needed to create this blue and white porcelain. And if you take a look, a little hard to see the dish on the right that has the carp, looks like a goldfish in the middle there. If you look at it closely, or if you go to the Met and take a look at it, you can actually see that it's pretty uneven shading on the plate. And that indicates just a lack of expertise. So this is clear, this is a really early example of some of that use of cobalt, where the artists are still getting used to how to apply it in a way that when they fire the plate, that it's actually going to come out and look okay. I mentioned earlier that with the trade routes, the Silk Roads, we saw just this merging of a lot of cultures, traditions, religions. And specific to religion, we see the merging of a lot of religious traditions being introduced into art. And this vase is a great example. It is a peony vase. And if you look at the center of the vase, that is a very traditional peony type scroll. However, if you look at the top, this also is a peony, and this is from Islamic art. If you take a look at the left-hand side, the picture of the pink peony that I have, you can see how it is very clearly copying kind of the Tibetan peony, that sort of image. And then the petals at the very base, kind of stylized, elongated petals, reflect Indo-Himalayan, so again, more Tibetan in nature. So I just thought that this vase was a great visual representation of kind of the merging of cultures and religions that we were seeing due again to all of the interchange that was happening on the trade routes. So we know that the Chinese really started in earnest exporting their china in the 1400s. So of course, by the 15th century, 14th century, so late 1300s, early 1400s. So by the 15th century, other people, other countries were realizing that, hey, this is a good way to make money. So we're going to start our own companies. And this is an example of china from Thailand that is specifically export china. So this would have been a manufacturer in Thailand making this specifically to export to other countries. And throughout this phase, pretty much really from the kind of the mid-1500s through today, we really start seeing a whole lot of copycats, and that's what makes this all interesting. But if you take a look on the left-hand side, that is Chinese. Also interesting to note that grapes are not native to China, so the way that they would have found out what grapes were from a trader, either bringing them in or talking about what grapes were. So the whole concept of they're using grape as a fruit, that definitely is an imported, a traded idea. It's something that they would have learned about from a trader. And we see over here on the right, the slightly darker plate is from Turkey, and we know in part that it's from Turkey because it's not pure white. So Turkey still hadn't cracked the code on how to make that pure white Chinese porcelain, but they sure were trying hard. So this is basically a slightly darker clay plate that is painted white to try to make it look like it's the same sort of white porcelain. When you have more competition, you up your game. So for China, this meant offering more customized products and continuing to maintain an extremely high level quality of product. And this is an example of a Tibetan altar bowl with an inscription in Tibetan from the early 15th century. And you can't see it here, but that inscription is repeated on the inside. So if you can imagine the talent it takes to essentially do a mirror image inscription on the inside, this was really extraordinary work. So again, the Chinese were prolific, but they were also producing extremely high quality art and producing pieces in porcelain that other countries were not capable of doing yet. They hadn't mastered all the details of that. So by the 16th century, this is when trade in Europe and trade across the world is really starting to pick up with China. China decides to up their game, and specifically because more people were starting to copy the white porcelain concept. So China in the 16th century said, hey, we'll change it up. We'll start doing vibrant colors. And if you look at this, you probably would guess it was made in Europe somewhere. It's not. It is made in China, and it actually was made for export to Japan. And it's called kinrandware because it looked like fabric with gold thread, and that fabric was called kinrand. So that's why it's called that. And you can kind of see that. But again, kind of interesting that China was making European-looking products to export to Japan. And again, because the trade routes with China were really opening up by the 16th century, Portuguese traders were very regularly going by sea to China, no longer just overland, that this is when we really saw trade with Europe opening up in earnest. This type of porcelain is called crack porcelain, and I first initially thought it was called crack because porcelain cracks, right? But it actually is the Dutch name for the Portuguese ships that carried the porcelain, the Caraca Portuguese ships. And if you take a look at this, the ways that you can tell what crack porcelain is, first of all, it's almost always blue and white, so we're kind of starting our trend there with Dutch porcelain being blue and white. This was exported to the Dutch market. So this was blue and white, but also the alternating panels of art. And you can see here we're kind of alternating the image of a thistle with some different images of fruit. So the outside rim with this kind of paneled art is very characteristic of this export crack porcelain. Up until the early 1700s, China produced mainly European-looking porcelain for the European market. So they basically were taking a look at what already was being produced in Europe and were making different versions of that, less expensive versions of that. But by about the 1730s, the European market was really flooded with that type of Chinese porcelain, and the demand switched to much more classical Asian art. And the VOC, which is the large Dutch trading company that more or less ran the world in the 1700s, they actually were really forcing this issue. So one of the things that they wanted, they specifically put an order in for Asian-looking themes with Asian-looking landscape, Asian-looking features, Asian-looking fruits and animals. So they were really all in on, hey, let's bring something unique, something exotic back to our countries. And in order to do that, the VOC actually employed an artist, Cornelis Pronk, to create designs that actually would be fabricated in China. And this is an example of that. So it's kind of hilarious that you have this this Dutch artist who is saying, oh, wait, I know exactly what the European market wants and the way that Europeans think about Dutch design. So that's why you have this delightful hodgepodge of images here. So you have a very European looking type trellis with some distinctly Japanese or Asian looking features on the faces here. And then you have, again, this kind of mix, the background, the flowers in the background looks a little like lotus flowers, very Asian. But then you have kind of what looks like European flowers. So it's this really unique mix. So that is all courtesy of Cornelis Pronk. But that, of course, was pretty expensive, right? Anytime you have to pay an artist to come up with designs, maybe, have them go to China, that becomes really expensive. So this is where the concept of transferware was developed. And this came about first by taking a look at books. So Europeans would look at books and be like, hey, here, we like this, make this into an image that is on porcelain. And this plate here is a copy of a wood block from a specific book. So they literally tore out pages of the book and then had their artist copy the art of that book. So it became a much cheaper way to come up with additional designs. And we also see this is where China would also do a lot of coats of arms. So if you were a European family, you usually had a coat of arms, and it was super easy to kind of send that off to China and be like, hey, here, I want to make a 120-piece place setting featuring my coat of arms. So that also became something that China excelled at. And I already talked about how much the different countries copied from each other, and I love this plate because it's a copy of a copy. So this is a Chinese plate, and this is actually copied from Japanese themes. So we might look at it and say, well, we know it's Asian, but the colors, the use of the dragon actually comes from Japan. So here is China copying Japanese themes again to ship to Europe. It's all part of them being good business people and saying, hey, what is considered exotic? Can we come up with new exotic designs? Sure, we'll just steal it from another Asian country and we'll put it on some porcelain. And I just had to share this picture because this is how far the exports went. So these are some Old Testament figures. Moses is in there with the 10 Commandments, kneeling down, David with his harp. And I just think that this is fabulous, that you actually would have commissioned, somebody in Europe would have commissioned a Chinese manufacturer to make all of these Christian figurines, Jewish and Christian figurines. And I can just imagine in the factory, they're like, what are we making? We have no idea. That's not our religion. We don't know what these things are. So just again, fun to see that even in the 1700s, it was still cheaper to kind of outsource these to China than look at developing the capacity within the existing factories in Europe. So by the 18th century, this would have been the late 18th, so late 1700s, early 1800s, we start to see a decrease with China. And this was due in large part to England and other European governments saying, hey, you know what? We have our own porcelain companies. Like, we need to up the ante. We need to do better and really drive buyers to our companies. And this is where you really start seeing investments by government in all of these companies. So some were flat out state run, other were private porcelain making companies that received some additional funding from the governments. And there's actually a book that just came out. It is called Porcelain. So if you Google that, but it talks all about the rise of the European-based porcelain companies. And the history of the book starts in the 1750s. So that's really where we see the trade shift from going from pretty much being dominated by China, with Europe kind of sort of doing a little bit, to really starting to be more dominated by Europe. And by 1779, China raised the duties on all of their imports and exports by 50%, which again increased prices, and primary reason for going to China by this time would have been for a lower price. So if that no longer is a driver, that eliminates a primary reason for buying from China. But good news, in 1784, the Empress of China, a ship that left from the United States, from New York City, landed in Canton, China. And Canton is now Guangzhou. It still is a port city. And this opened up an entirely new market. So it was great that it happened just as Europe was starting to decline in their use of the Chinese porcelain market, that now China had a brand new marketplace. And by 1784, everyone needed China in the US. So it was a great deal for them. And just so that we're aware of how difficult this was, this is the actual route that the Empress of China actually took. So again, I love that it all starts and ends in New York City, of course, but it would have departed from New York City and then, goes all the way around the continent of Africa before swinging back up and landing in Canton, China, and then repeating that whole route to get back home. So this was definitely a long and difficult journey. So shortly after that ship made its first journey to China, George Washington decided, hey, maybe we need some fancy china at the White House, and honestly really started the tradition of White House china. And this china set, the very first china set used by George Washington in the White House, came from China, and it dates there, they can't determine exactly when, but somewhere between 1784, which would have been the year that the first ship went to China, to 1786. So it definitely was in one of those very early trips to China. And the great thing about this is, George Washington, a bunch of other guys, they were well traveled. Thomas Jefferson, he loved to go shopping in Paris. He was a total shopaholic. So they were very accustomed to the ornate china and porcelain sets that you would find in Europe. And George Washington said, enough of that. We're the United States. We want something that is good and majestically plain. So if you were wondering about kind of the odd design of this presidential china, it's because George himself wanted it to be majestically plain. So this is how the Chinese interpreted that, and this was the first White House china. And of course, Thomas Jefferson, the shopaholic, had to get in on the game. And this is an example. So this is china from Jefferson's collection that is still at Mount Vernon. And this actually wasn't imported from China. This is something that he would have purchased in Europe. So this was export china that was porcelain made in China, that was exported to the European market, that Thomas Jefferson then brought back on one of his many voyages from Europe. But now it is at Mount Vernon if you would like to see it. And by this point, late 1700s, trade of porcelain is everywhere, and definitely led to some interesting mixing of styles. This is one of my favorites. This is back at the Met in those cases along the balcony. And this is a great example of a very European man dressed in European finery, sitting on top of a very Chinese lion, because why not, right? So definitely see a mixing of styles. And again, because there was so much more competition, so many different companies getting in on the action, remember that this was the time when the European companies were really developing in their capacity and capabilities, that we saw a lot of trading of ideas, if not outright theft of ideas. And there's some great examples at the Met of this. These are just 3 plates, and a little hard to see, but the basic concept is if you look at those 3 plates, they all are the same image. It is from a story, and it's the same 2 people from this story. And if you take a look, they are produced from left to right in England, Germany, and Japan, even though they were originally borrowed from a Chinese story. And then to really kind of draw the end of the Chinese era to a close, by the mid-1800s, again, the European governments were investing in really building their capabilities. And this is an example, again, of just kind of the sharing. If you go back to the slide where I talked about the crack chinaware, these are all examples of knockoff copies of crock, right? Because they all kind of have the very similar borders of the alternating plates along the border. But in fact, these are made from China, Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, and the one on the bottom here that's a little more stylistically unique is from Italy. And that brings us all the way back to the United States. And starting with China and their ability to produce this pure white, highly sought after porcelain, it all began with them discovering these kaolin mines. And in the US, those mines were discovered in the late 1700s in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Georgia. So that led to the US developing in our own porcelain manufacturing. And this is an example from Union Porcelain Works. This was established in 1862 in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And I chose them as an example. I think the earliest company was actually in 1826 in Philadelphia, but we had to keep it New York. So this one is from Brooklyn. But also Union Porcelain Works is known for having the finest china of any manufacturer of the time. And one of the reasons why they had the finest china is because their key designer was from a German manufacturing company. So they basically stole talent from Europe in order to allow them to replicate the same types of china in the US. So here again, we start seeing the broad distribution of US-based china throughout the 1800s and the 1900s. And again, I just think it's great. It brings it all to a close that the design and manufacturing that we did in the US was based on the European techniques that were originally based on the Chinese techniques and that pure white porcelain china that was very first made in China in the 800s. So, end of the day, we can be thankful to trade routes for giving us porcelain that we know and love, and it really is kind of a fun way to really trace the development of porcelain from China all the way to our dinner tables today. So thanks for joining me on this virtual tour of the Met. I do hope that you go to the Met on your own and take a look at these yourselves. But thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to our next class.